Welcome to Reaching Higher New Hampshire's media briefing on the ED 306 Administrative Rules, New Hampshire's minimum standards for public school approval. Delivering this overview today is Nicole Highmark, Executive Director of Reaching Higher New Hampshire, and
Christina Pretorius, Policy Director with Reaching Higher New Hampshire.
once again, welcome, and we're going to jump right into this overview. Let's begin with a little information about who we are and what we do as Reaching Higher New Hampshire. Our mission is to provide all New Hampshire children with the opportunity to prepare for college, for immediate careers, and for the challenges and opportunities of life in the 21st century by serving as the state's public education policy resource center. Our founding belief is that our public schools are an essential public good and thrive when they are supported by both their states and communities. We do this by focusing our work in three broad buckets: informing the public about what is taking place in our public schools and policy efforts, contextualizing the issues by examining data so that people can better understand policy and releasing policy briefs, and engaging a wide range of stakeholders in information about our public schools. Today, we focus on the minimum standards for public school approval. These standards are the administrative rules that implement some of the most critical elements of public education law. Oftentimes, our legislature passes really broad laws that require more detail. State agencies, and in this case, the New Hampshire Education Department, is charged with rulemaking to offer more clarity on what has been passed by our state legislature so that implementation can be seamless. The minimum standards are the rules that govern all public schools in New Hampshire and are designed to set standards so that all public schools are operating by the same regulations. Ultimately, these rules ensure all students are receiving a comparable education no matter where they live. These are the foundational standards for each and every public school here in New Hampshire. And with that framing, I'm going to pass the baton on to Christina Pretorius, who's going to walk through some key takeaways of the latest publication of our minimum standards for public school approval.
Thanks, Nicole. Just as a little bit of ground setting, this analysis that Reaching Higher New Hampshire has done is based on the February 2024 initial proposal that has been voted on by the State Board of Education and that will have public hearings in April. All of this analysis is based on that document, which we will be sharing with folks. And just kind of as a broad takeaway, our findings indicate that the New Hampshire Department of Education's proposed overhaul presents a very different vision for public schools, one that de-emphasizes teaching and instruction, one that moves toward the facilitation of learning instead of that teaching and instruction, and replaces instruction and courses with learning opportunities, eliminating class size requirements, and changing course mandates. These language changes are critical. The rules, as Nicole said, are a baseline for all public schools, and ambiguity in these rules could mean an unequal application and could have significant impacts both at the state level and at the local level. And since these are the rules that implement key education laws like RSA 193E, there could be school funding implications. So given these large-scale changes that we've found, we've condensed these into 5 key themes: redefining the purpose and structure of school, hollowing out instructional requirements, the removal of local authority, lawmaking through rules, and potential school funding implications. The first one we're going to be diving into today is redefining the purpose and structure of a school. We see this in many areas throughout the rules, including the removal of the term courses and the removal of the term programs, and replacing them with, quote, learning opportunities. This is throughout the document. We also see it in one interesting change where school boards must offer credit for these learning opportunities, quote, regardless of enrollment status. This particular change raises some substantial questions, including, will a school board have to award credit even if the student is not enrolled? Does this open the door to part-time student enrollment? What does that mean for school boards? What does that mean for students? What does it mean for schools? So all of these things together, we're seeing this picture being painted of a different purpose and a different structure of public schools in New Hampshire. Our second takeaway, the hollowing out of instructional requirements, it encompasses a lot of changes. Here you'll see a couple of examples, and we do try to put page numbers throughout where we can directly reference them. But it encompasses a number of changes, from changing, quote, teaching to the facilitation of learning, from removing the authority of certified educators in ensuring that students are proficient and are learning, which is an example that we have found since 2022. So that has been a longstanding concern, that removal of the role of the certified educator, and changing the goal of learning from mastery of content to proficiency in content, from mastery of competencies to proficiency of competencies. This is another one that we've been tracking, and it's been a very consistent concern throughout the entire process. It's one that we've heard from the public. It's one that we've heard from educators. It's one that we've heard from competency-based education experts and researchers as well. That is one that remains in this February 2024 document. So that one has remained pretty standard. And hyper-focusing, the NHED's proposal also hyper-focuses on individual students rather than systemic approaches to student performance. So, we see on page 9 where schools now have to address academic, quote, underperformance of individual students, removing that systemic approach that we know is so important to making sure that all schools are addressing these challenges in a comprehensive way. Our third key takeaway has to do with the removal of local authority. This one has also been a longstanding concern, one that was raised first by Reaching Higher in 2022 with our very first analysis. We see that the New Hampshire Department of Education continues to remove district competencies and graduation competencies and replaces them with a set of statewide graduation expectations. These are 20, quote, graduation expectations. These are statements, one required for each credit. So there is a lot of movement in what makes a high school diploma a high school diploma. Under current law and current rules, high schools have, school districts have their own graduation and district competencies. That replaces all of that with these 20 graduation expectation statements. We see local graduation and district competencies removed, as well as course requirements in favor of these credits and graduation expectations, which means, one of the questions that we have is, are these high school requirements and ultimately diplomas, are high school diplomas in New Hampshire now tied to these 20 graduation expectations rather than, the district and graduation competencies that they are currently under? What does that mean for New Hampshire's public schools? What does it mean for our high school graduates in terms of being prepared for college and career? And what does it mean for, folks who want to go on, want to, go to college, want to go into a career? What does that diploma mean to them? So that's a big question that we have moving forward. One of the other changes that we observed deals with how students demonstrate proficiency to get credit. So under current rules, there are a couple of options. It's through an assessment approved by the local school district or the New Hampshire Department of Education if there isn't one, but there's very clear authority where the school district determines it, or the New Hampshire Department of Education can develop an assessment if the school district does not have one. But the proposed overhaul adds a quote competency-based assessment unquote option. The thing about this one though is that there's no detail. There's no detail, there's no definition, and there's no authority as to the body that approves that competency-based assessment. It's unclear exactly what it means, exactly what it must entail, what must it include, how does it ensure that students are reaching that proficiency. It's unclear what it means or who decides what it means. We know that competency-based assessments have been used by school districts in the past. Some schools are still using them now too. But we also know that under other programs like Learn Everywhere, vendors are the ones who create their own assessments without input or approval from schools, who ultimately are required to award that credit. And so this is a big one in terms of where the authority lies, because it is ambiguous. There is no indication of who decides what makes that competency-based assessment worthy of credit. And there's also no requirements in terms of what that competency-based assessment would have to include. So that's one big question that we have going in. That's one of the big themes that we saw throughout with that one in particular. So finally, one of the other changes that we're seeing is actually around the role of the school. So under current rules, high schools and districts create programs and they determine how those programs will lead to a diploma. The New Hampshire Department of Education's overhaul would change that. So if passed, high schools would instead have to ensure that, quote, ensure that learning opportunities lead to a diploma. It is a subtle shift, but it's one that we think would be significant for public schools moving forward. It would very much shift the role of the school in determining what programs lead to a diploma, what those programs look like. Our fourth theme has to do with lawmaking through rules. This section, it doesn't necessarily follow the same theme of the other takeaways. We're seeing a lot of pieces kind of in different sections. But we're seeing shadows of controversial legislation being proposed throughout the rules. So there are a number of examples here. The first one that we did want to flag is the New Hampshire Department of Education proposed changes dealing with reading instruction. So a lot of folks in New Hampshire know that reading instruction, how children are taught how to read, has been a hot topic in the New Hampshire legislature and nationwide for a few years now. We see that, House Bill 437 was laid on the table last year, but, on page 25 of the proposed rule change, we see some changes having to do with reading instruction. And so, our question is, what is the role of lawmakers here and what is the role of the department, and how are those two things intertwined? There are some other changes as well. One of the really big changes is the shift from shall to may in the program elements, which is the second half of the rule proposal. To take a step back at the risk of getting too deep in the weeds. So taking a step back, the State Board of Education has split the minimum standards proposal into two pieces, one half and a second half. The first half of the minimum standards proposal outlines really what public schools are, what programs they must offer, all of the policies that they have to have. The second half, as they've split it, are what we call the program elements, and those outline what the required programs have to include, from specific pieces like interviewing skills for a business course, or, one of the program elements is planned activities that promote developing mathematical concepts. And so these are this is the kind of structure of what makes a content area program an actual program. What is a math program? What does a science program have to include? Those kinds of things. So those elements are required to really ensure that all students, regardless of the school that they attend, have similar opportunities. But the New Hampshire Department of Education's proposal shifts that shall mandate that's in the program elements to a may, which could make these requirements optional. That is a massive shift. in not only what a school would be required to do, but could also have significant implications for educational equity and school funding. We found that this echoes House Bill 1671 from 2022. This was a highly controversial bill that the Commissioner of Education introduced in the House Education Committee. It would have gutted the required subjects of the content of an adequate education. The legislature ultimately did not move forward with that proposal, but we are seeing shadows of that throughout the New Hampshire Department of Education's proposed minimum standards overhaul. There are a couple of other instances, but the last piece I would like to highlight here is the removal of the authority for local school districts to assign certified teachers in content areas outside of their certification area. So for instance, in practice right now, that could be a biology teacher who teaches a single chemistry course, you know, in a public school. Removing this authority for the minor content area assignments could significantly impact many schools across the state. And we see a parallel effort here in the legislature. So lawmakers this year are leading efforts to allow uncertified teachers in the classroom as long as they teach part-time. So putting these two pieces together, what we see is this could create an environment where schools are required to bring in part-time uncertified teachers to teach in content areas that certified teachers are no longer permitted to teach. So in that example of the biology teacher teaching a chemistry course, you know, by removing that authority for the local school board to allow that biology teacher to teach that chemistry course, will they now be required to instead hire a part-time teacher to teach that chemistry course instead of just simply allowing that bio teacher to do that? That is a pretty significant change that we are seeing and following. And I think altogether, they will all have significant impacts for public schools, but that one in particular is one that would have a big impact on the teaching profession. Our final key takeaway has to do with the potential school funding implications. I think all of them so far have school funding implications, especially considering these are the rules that really put into practice education law, which is what, you know, the state courts are ruling on in terms of funding. But to really put a fine point on it, there are a number of school funding implications, from the removal of the class size requirements to the removal of cross references for program of studies. It's unclear how these changes will directly impact schools. We can make some observations and we can make, you know, we can make some assumptions and things like that, but the exact impact that it will have, I think, will be felt for years to come. There are expected to be statewide funding implications, especially as the state is in the midst of two major school funding lawsuits. And, you know, in addition to that state funding impact, we're also expecting some local school funding implications, you know, without requiring schools to have specific programs, without outlining what those programs are and should be. We could see, you know, we would expect to see that play out in local deliberative sessions, in local town meetings, you know, with school boards, with local residents, perhaps disagreeing over what they can and should offer. We've seen some of this in the past couple of years in New Hampshire at the local level. And so I think the ambiguity in some of these changes and some of the really the more pointed changes would kind of amplify that at the local level and certainly at the state level as well. So with that, I'm going to shift it over to Nicole, who's going to share some of the potential outcomes.
Yes, thank you, Christina. So I want to emphasize here that reaching higher analysis and our 5 key takeaways really look to summarize what are the big ideas we're noticing in the latest proposed changes, as Christina said, dated February 15th, 2024. And more importantly, we want to laser in on the impact. We're not speculating about the intent of these changes. our analysis really rests solidly on what will be the effect of these changes on our young people, on our communities, and on our schools. So with that highlight, I want to speak to how the current proposal really shifts the emphasis away from high quality teaching and learning and learner development in our schools, and really moves our schools to a model where they merely certify competency or competency statements and issue credits. This model could potentially remove the validity of those competencies, especially with the hollowing out of instructional requirements and developing programs on state academic standards that are either expired, that are out of date, and not based on the latest research. Furthermore, it appears that these rules withdraw or retreat from local decision making, meaning that local decision making is taken away from our communities and our community elected school boards, offering them really little control over the curriculum and instruction that happens in their neighborhood schools, and equally as important, the approval of programs that lead to graduation and life after high school for our young people. So a big idea that we're tracking and an outcome that really has a large open question attached to it is, what do all these changes mean for our graduates? And that transitions us really nicely to some prioritized open questions that Reaching Higher New Hampshire has identified in our analysis of these proposed rules. And I'm not going to go through and read each of these questions, although what I might do is highlight a couple. But more importantly, I want to speak to that many of these questions remain open based on the current proposal. And some of the most critical questions include, what is bulleted here? And as this process moves forward, it's really necessary that clear answers to these questions manifest for transparency, for public understanding of the proposal and the corresponding impact. And, of particular interest is we've observed a lot of inconsistencies and contradictions in the current proposed overhaul. And open for us is, how is the State Board of Education going to address these inconsistencies and contradictions our team and our analysis has tracked, and what's going to be done about them? Additionally, and Christina did a lovely job on this, is getting direct answers about what the expected impact is on school funding. We've had decades upon decades battles around school funding, and we have court cases, making their way right now. And so tinkering with these rules, and I would argue it's more than tinkering with these rules, really has big implications to school funding, and the court cases. And then lastly, and we've touched, really little on this, but how are student, parent, and community voices going to be incorporated in this proposal? It has been a long and drawn out process, but questions remain about commitment to integrating community and statewide voice into this proposal, and being able to see and track those changes as folks really demonstrate efforts to design a system and revise these rules that offer great opportunities for students, and recognizing, that our public schools are an essential public good, and that they thrive most when they are well supported by their communities and states. So that's a little bit about the open questions. I imagine there are also wonderings about the next steps in the process. And so 2 public hearings have been confirmed, as I understand it. And as Christina highlighted, those public hearings break the document, the current proposal, into two sections. The front half of the section, and the public hearing is scheduled for April 3rd at 1 o'clock. And then the second section, which are the program elements, so an arts program, a business program, a social studies program, Holocaust and genocide program. And that public hearing is scheduled for April 11th. And I think we can end on that note and that point, and encourage all of our members of the media that you can do not hesitate to reach out to any one member of our Reaching Higher team. We are happy to be resources for you all. Thank you.